Sape gatito, chamburradito, una tablilla y otro poquito, una y una dos, dos y dos son cuatro, cuatro y dos son seis y dos son ocho y dos son diez, diez y nada de ser nada. I will repeat it. Sape gatito, champur.
Hey everybody, what's up? Welcome back to A People's Historian. I'm Jason Kishinev, and we're reading Chapter 1 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, reading about Columbus and Arawaks. Remember, if you enjoy what you hear today, hit that like and subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and we'll keep you notified each time I make a new video. Let's dig in. To emphasize the heroism of Columbus and his successors as navigators and discoverers, and to de-emphasize their genocide, is not a technical necessity but an ideological choice. It serves unwittingly to justify what was done. My point is not that we must, in telling history, accuse, judge, condemn Columbus in absentia. It is too late for that. It would be a useless scholarly exercise in morality. But the easy acceptance of atrocities as a deplorable but necessary price to pay for progress, Hiroshima and Vietnam to save Western civilization, Kronstadt and Hungary to save socialism, nuclear proliferation to save us all, this is still with us. One reason these atrocities are still with us is that we have learned to bury them in a mass of other facts, as radioactive wastes are buried in containers in the earth. We have learned to give them exactly the same proportion of attention that teachers and writers often give them in the most respectable of classrooms and textbooks. This learned sense of moral proportion, coming from the apparent objectivity of the scholar, is accepted more easily than when it comes from politicians at press conferences. It is therefore more deadly. The treatment of heroes, Columbus, and their victims, the Arawaks, the quiet acceptance of conquest and murder in the name of progress, is only one aspect of a certain approach to history in which the past is told from the point of view of governments, conquerors, diplomats, leaders. It is as if they, like Columbus, deserve universal acceptance. As if they, the founding fathers, Jackson, Lincoln, Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy, the leading members of Congress, the famous justices of the Supreme Court, represent the nation as a whole. The pretense is that there really is such a thing as the United States, subject to occasional conflicts and quarrels, but fundamentally a community of people with common interests. It is as if there really is a national interest represented in the Constitution, in territorial expansion, in the laws passed by Congress, the decisions of the courts, the development of capitalism, the culture of education, and the mass media. History is the memory of states, wrote Henry Kissinger in his first book, A World Restored, in which he proceeded to tell the history of 19th century Europe from the viewpoint of the leaders of Austria and England, ignoring the millions who suffered from those statesmen's policies. From his standpoint, the peace that Europe had before the French Revolution was restored by the diplomacy of a few national leaders. But for factory workers in England, farmers in France, colored people in Asia and Africa, women and children everywhere except in the upper classes, it was a world of conquest, violence, hunger, exploitation, a world not restored but disintegrated. My viewpoint in telling the history of the United States is different. that we must not accept the memory of states as our own. Nations are not communities and never have been. The history of any country, presented as the history of a family, conceals fierce conflicts of interest, sometimes exploding, most often repressed, between conquerors and conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers, dominators and dominated in race and sex. And in such a world of conflict, a world of victims and executioners, it is the job of thinking people, as Albert Camus suggested, not to be on the side of the executioners. Thus, in that inevitable taking of sides which comes from selection and emphasis in history, I prefer to try to tell the story of the discovery of America from the viewpoint of the Arawaks, of the Constitution from the standpoint of the slaves, of Andrew Jackson as seen by the Cherokees, of the Civil War as seen by the New York Irish, of the Mexican War as seen by the deserting soldiers of Scott's army, of the rise of industrialism as seen by the young women in the Lowell textile mills, of the Spanish-American War as seen by the Cubans, the conquest of the Philippines as seen by black soldiers on Luzon, the Gilded Age as seen by Southern farmers, the First World War as seen by socialists, the Second World War as seen by pacifists, the New Deal as seen by blacks in Harlem, the post-war American empire as seen by peons in Latin America, and so on, to the limited extent that any one person, however he or she strains, can see history from the standpoint of others. My point is not to grieve for the victims and denounce the executioners. Those tears, that anger, cast into the past, deplete our moral energy for the present, and the lines are not always clear. In the long run, the oppressor is also a victim. In the short run, and so far human history has consisted only of short runs, the victims themselves, desperate and tainted with the culture that oppresses them, turn on other victims. Still understanding the complexities, this book will be skeptical of governments and their attempts through politics and culture to ensnare ordinary people in a giant web of nationhood pretending to a common interest. I will try not to overlook the cruelties that victims inflict on one another as they are jammed together in the boxcars of the system. I don't want to romanticize them, but I do remember, in rough paraphrase, a statement I once read: "The cry of the poor is not always just, but if you don't listen to it, you will never know what justice is." I don't want to invent victories for people's movements, but to think that history writing must aim simply to recapitulate the failures that dominate the past is to make historians collaborators in an endless cycle of defeat. If history is to be creative, to anticipate a possible future without denying the past, it should, I believe, emphasize new possibilities by disclosing those hidden episodes of the past when, even if in brief flashes, people showed their ability to resist, to join together, occasionally to win. I am supposing, or perhaps only hoping, that our future may be found in the past's fugitive moments of compassion rather than in its solid centuries of warfare. That, being as blunt as I can, is my approach to the history of the United States. The reader may as well know that before going on, or the listener. What Columbus did to the Arawaks of the Bahamas, Cortez did to the Aztecs of Mexico, Pizarro to the Incas of Peru, and the English settlers of Virginia and Massachusetts to the Powhatans and the Pequots. Sorry if I mispronounced that. The Aztec civilization of Mexico came out of the heritage of Mayan, Zapotec, and Toltec cultures. It built enormous constructions from stone tools and human labor, developed a writing system and a priesthood. It also engaged in, let us not overlook this, the ritual killing of thousands of people as sacrifices to the gods. The cruelty of the Aztecs, however, did not erase a certain innocence, and when a Spanish armada appeared at Veracruz, and a bearded white man came ashore with strange beasts, horses, clad in iron, it was thought that he was the legendary Aztec man-god who had died 300 years before with the promise to return, the mysterious Quetzalcoatl. Again, sorry about the pronunciation. And so they welcomed him with munificent hospitality. That was Hernando Cortés, come from Spain with an expedition financed by merchants and landowners and blessed by the deputies of God with one obsessive goal: to find gold. In the mind of Montezuma, the king of the Aztecs, there must have been a certain doubt about whether Cortés was indeed Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl. There you go. Because he sent 100 runners to Cortés bearing enormous treasures, gold and silver, wrought into objects of fantastic beauty, but at the same time begging him to go back. The painter Dürer, a few years later, described what he saw just arrived in Spain from that expedition: a sun of gold, a moon of silver, worth a fortune. Cortés then began his march of death from town to town, using deception, turning Aztec against Aztec, killing with the kind of deliberateness that accompanies a strategy to paralyze the will of the population by a sudden frightful deed. And so, in Cholulu, he invited the headmen of the Cholula nation to the square, and when they came with thousands of unarmed retainers, Cortés' small army of Spaniards, posted around the square with cannon, armed with crossbows, mounted on horses, massacred them down to the last man. Then they looted the city and moved on. When their cavalcade of murder was over, they were in Mexico City. Montezuma was dead, and the Aztec civilization, shattered, was in the hands of the Spaniards. All this is told in the Spaniards' own accounts. In Peru, that other Spanish conquistador, Pizarro, used the same tactics and for the same reasons. The frenzy in the early capitalist states of Europe for gold, for slaves, for products of the soil, to pay the bondholders and stockholders of the expeditions, to finance the monarchical bureaucracies rising in Western Europe, to spur the growth of the new money economy rising out of feudalism, to participate in what Karl Marx would later call the primitive accumulation of capital. These were the violent beginnings of an intricate system of technology, business, politics, and culture that would dominate the world for the next 500 centuries. In the North American English colonies, the pattern was set early, as Columbus had set it in the islands of the Bahamas in 1585, before there was any permanent English settlement in Virginia. Richard Grenville landed there with 7 ships. The Indians he met were hospitable, but when one of them stole a small silver cup, Grenville sacked and burned the whole Indian village. Jamestown itself was set up inside the territory of an Indian confederacy led by the chief Powhatan. Powhatan watched the English settle on his people's land, but did not attack, maintaining a posture of coolness. When the English were going through their starving time in the winter of 1610, some of them ran off to join the Indians, where they would at least be fed. When the summer came, the governor of the colony sent a messenger to ask Powhatan to return the runaways, whereupon Powhatan, according to the English account, replied with no other than proud and disdainful answers. Some soldiers were therefore sent out to take revenge. They fell upon an Indian settlement, killed 15 or 16 Indians, burned the houses, cut down the corn growing around the village, took the queen of the tribe and her children into boats, then ended up throwing the children overboard. And, wow, this spelling is unusual. I don't know if this is bad spelling or just old spelling, but I think it says shooting, and shooting out their brains in the water. That's what it says. The queen was later taken off and stabbed to death. 12 years later, the Indians, alarmed as the English settlements kept growing in numbers, apparently decided to try to wipe them out for good. They went on a rampage and massacred 347 men, women, and children. From then on, it was total war. Not able to enslave the Indians and not able to live with them, the English decided to exterminate them. Edmund Morgan writes in his History of Early Virginia, American Slavery, American Freedom, since the Indians were better woodsmen than the English and virtually impossible to track down, the method was to feign peaceful intentions. Let them settle down and plant their corn wherever they chose, and then, just before harvest, fall upon them, killing as many as possible and burning the corn. Within 2 or 3 years of the massacre, the English had avenged the deaths of that day many times over. In that first year of the white man in Virginia, 1607, Powhatan had addressed a plea to John Smith that turned out prophetic. How authentic it is may be in doubt, but it is so much like so many Indian statements that it may be taken as, if not the rough letter of that first plea, the exact spirit of it. I have seen 2 generations of my people die. I know the difference between peace and war better than any man in my country. I am now grown old and must die soon. My authority must descend to my brothers, Opichapan, Opichan Kano, and Katatog. Sorry about that. It's like I'm sure I mispronounced every single one of those. Still going though. Then to my 2 sisters and then to my 2 daughters, I wish them to know as much as I do, and that your love to them may be like mine to you. Will you take by force what you may have quietly by love? Why will you destroy us who supply you with food? What can you get by war? We can hide our provisions and run into the woods. Then you will starve from wronging your friends. Why are you jealous of us? We are unarmed and willing to give you what you ask if you come in a friendly manner, and not so simple as not to know that it is much better to eat good meat, sleep comfortably, live quietly with my wives and children, laugh and be merry with the English, and trade for their copper and hatchets, to run away from them and to lie cold in the woods, feed on acorns, roots, and such trash, and be so hunted that I can neither eat nor sleep. In these wars my men must sit up watching, and if a twig break, they all cry out, "Here comes Captain Smith!" So I must end my miserable life. Take away your guns and swords, the cause of all our jealousy, or you may all die in the same manner. When the Pilgrims came to New England, they too were coming not to vacant land, but to territory inhabited by tribes of Indians. The governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, created the excuse to take Indian land by declaring the area legally a vacuum. The Indians, he said, had not subdued the land, and therefore had not a natural right to it. I'm using air quotes a lot, aren't I? But had not a natural right to it. Had only a natural right to it, but not a civil right. Excuse me. A natural right did not have legal standing. The Puritans also appealed to the Bible. Psalms chapter 2, verse 8. Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. And to justify their use of force to take the land, they cited Romans chapter 13, verse 2. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. The Puritans lived in uneasy truce with the Pequot Indians, who occupied what is now southern Connecticut and Rhode Island. But they wanted them out of the way. They wanted their land, and they seemed to want also to establish their rule firmly over Connecticut settlers in that area. The murder of a white trader, Indian kidnapper, and troublemaker became an excuse to make war on the Pequots in 1636. A punitive expedition left Boston to attack the Narragansett Indians on Block Island, who were lumped with the Pequots. As Governor Winthrop wrote, they had commissioned to put to death the men of Block Island, but to spare the women and children, and to bring them away, and to take possession of the island, and from thence to go to the Pequods, to demand the murderers of Captain Stone and other English, and 1,000 fathom of wampum for damages, etc., and some of their children as hostages, which if they should refuse, they were to obtain by force. Lovely. The English landed and killed some Indians, but the rest hid in the thick forests of the island, and the English went from one deserted village to the next, destroying crops. Then they sailed back to the mainland and raided Pequot villages along the coast, destroying crops again. One of the officers of that expedition, in his account, gives some insight into the Pequots they encountered. It says Pequod in the quote, but he spells it Pequot. I'm sure it's just a time-related spelling. One of the officers of that expedition, in his account, gives some insight into the Pequots they encountered. The Indians spying on us came running in multitudes along the waterside, crying, "What cheer, Englishmen? What cheer? What do you come for?" They, not thinking we intended war, went on cheerfully. So the war with the Pequots began. Massacres took place on both sides. The English developed the tactic of warfare used earlier by Cortez, and later in the 20th century even more systematically, deliberate attacks on non-combatants for the purpose of terrorizing the enemy. This is ethno-historian Francis Jennings' interpretation of Captain John Mason's attack on a Pequot village on the Mystic River near Long Island Sound. Mason proposed to avoid attacking Pequot warriors, which would have overtaxed his unseasoned, unreliable troops. Battle as such was not his purpose. Battle is only one of the ways to destroy an enemy's will to fight. Massacre can accomplish the same end with less risk, and Mason had determined that massacre would be his objective. So the English set fire to the wigwams of the village. By their own account, the captain also said, "We must burn them," and immediately stepping into the wigwam, brought out a firebrand, and putting it into the mats with which they were covered, set the wigwams on fire. William Bradford, in his History of the Plymouth Plantation, written at the time, describes John Mason's raid on the Pequot village. Those that escaped the fire were slain with the sword, some hewed to pieces, others hewn through with their rapiers, so as they were quickly dispatched, and very few escaped. It was conceived they thus destroyed about 400 at this time. It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire, and the streams of blood quenching the same, and horrible was the stink and scent thereof. But the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave the prayers thereof to God, who hath wrought so wonderfully for them, thus to enclose their enemies in their hands, and give them so speedy a victory over so proud and insulting an enemy. As Dr. Cotton Mather, Puritan theologian, put it, it was supposed that no less than 600 Pequot souls were brought down to hell that day. The war continued. Indian tribes were used against one another and never seemed able to join together in fighting the English. Jennings sums up, the terror was very real among the Indians, but in time they came to meditate upon its foundations. They drew 3 lessons from the Pequot War. 1, that the Englishman's most solemn pledge would be broken whenever obligation conflicted with advantage. 2, that the English way of war had no limit of scruple or mercy. And 3, that weapons of Indian making were almost useless against weapons of European manufacture. These lessons the Indians took to heart. A footnote in Virgil Vogel's book, This Land Was Ours, from 1972, says the official figure on the number of Pequots now in Connecticut is 21 persons. Thanks for joining me. Tune in for the next episode and we'll finish Chapter 1. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and hit that notification bell. See you next time.